What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Imagine walking into your own home and realizing that every sound, every breath, and every word no longer belongs to you, because the two people you trusted most in this world had already rewritten your story without even telling you. That was the moment my world crashed, and no matter how much time has passed since then, I can still taste the bitterness in my mouth when I replay the details. I wasn't naive, though my family liked to call me that afterward. I knew my marriage wasn't perfect, but whoever has one that is. Still, I believed in the vows we spoke in front of everyone. I believed in the long nights when we whispered plans about children and vacations and the life we were building together. And I especially believed in my brother, my own blood. Because betrayal from a stranger is one thing, but betrayal from family feels like being stabbed with the very knife you used to slice their birthday cake. It started with the smallest cracks, the kind you almost laugh off because the alternative, facing the truth, is too painful. My husband, Mark, who once couldn't go 5 minutes without telling me about his workday, suddenly had nothing much to report. My brother, Daniel, who used to call me for advice about every girl he dated, went quiet, unavailable, too busy to even share a beer on the porch. At first, I told myself life had just picked up speed for everyone. I had my own job, my own struggles, and, honestly, I wanted to believe I was just imagining the shift. But then I started noticing the glances. Not from strangers, not from colleagues, but between Mark and Daniel, subtle at first, so quick you'd think you dreamed it, until it happened again, and my stomach began to clench every time they were in the same room. The night the truth came out wasn't explosive, it was worse. I came home from work early, arms full of groceries, planning to surprise Mark with his favorite dinner. The house was too quiet, and I thought maybe he was still at the office. Then I heard laughter, low and intimate, drifting from our bedroom. When I pushed open the door, what I saw wasn't a cheap fling or a careless mistake, it was tenderness. My husband and my brother, tangled together with no shame, looking at each other the way Mark used to look at me. I dropped the grocery bag, and the sound of oranges rolling across the floor might as well have been a grenade. They froze, but no one spoke. In that silence, I realized that my marriage had been over long before I walked into that room. The weeks after were a blur of humiliation and arguments that felt more like interrogations. My parents didn't defend me. They actually told me I should try to understand, because love was unpredictable, and Daniel and Mark were clearly meant for each other. Imagine hearing that from your own mother, the same woman who told you your wedding day was the happiest day of her life. Suddenly, I was disposable, a footnote in their perfect story. I packed my things and left, not because I was ready, but because staying would have killed me slowly, and I wasn't willing to give them that satisfaction. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a fridge that rattled like it was about to die. Every night, I sat on the secondhand couch with a glass of wine and thought about how quickly everything had collapsed. And yet, there was a stubborn part of me that refused to break entirely. I still laughed at sitcom reruns, still bought myself flowers on Fridays, still held my head up at work even when whispers followed me like shadows. My brother and Mark, meanwhile, built their happy little world. They bought a house, hosted barbecues, smiled in holiday photos that my mother sent to me even though she knew it tore me apart. I was expected to swallow it, to play the bigger person, and sometimes I almost convinced myself that I had. But anger doesn't vanish, it waits. Every time I heard my brother's name, my pulse quickened. Every time I saw my ex-husband's face on social media, smiling with Daniel, my throat tightened. Yet I carried on, building my life from the ashes, believing the worst was behind me. That betrayal, I told myself, was the last card Daniel would ever play against me. I was wrong. Years later, just when I thought the scar had faded enough to live with, the phone rang. It was my mother, her voice trembling in a way I hadn't heard since my grandmother died. She said Daniel's name like it was both a curse and a prayer, and I felt my body go cold before she even explained. I knew instinctively that something had happened, something that would drag me right back into the storm I had barely escaped. I thought betrayal had already taken everything from me. I hadn't yet learned what desperation could demand. And as I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to my mother's shaky words, I realized Daniel wasn't finished with me after all. My mother did not breathe for a few seconds after saying Daniel's name, as if the air itself might change the outcome if she touched it too fast, and then in a rush that made me grip the counter with my free hand, she spilled out a jumble of phrases about a wet road, a wrong turn, a guardrail that did not forgive, an ambulance that screamed like it had a personal stake in the matter, and the surgeons who wanted decisions and signatures and money before night folded into morning, and while she cried into the phone that I should remember he was my brother, I stared at the crooked magnet on my fridge and thought about the last time I was asked to be the bigger person by people who never noticed how small they had made me. I drove to the hospital because even when you swear you are done with being the dependable one, your muscles still remember the route to responsibility. And the fluorescent lights met me with that familiar hospital smell of baked plastic and lemon antiseptic that always suggests both hope and defeat. And before anyone officially greeted me, I saw Mark standing by the coffee machine, unshaven and vibrating like a cable under tension, clutching a paper cup that had already collapsed at the rim, and when his eyes found mine, he did not look like a victor or a thief or a husband who had finally landed where he belonged. He looked like a boy who had pushed a dare too far and wanted an adult to fix it. My mother came at me with a hurricane of questions and accusations. How could I think about leaving? How could I bring up old history at a time like this? How could I let Daniel's life hang on a number that I alone had the power to write? And I let her talk until her throat rasped, because there is no sentence short enough to make a lifetime of minimization vanish, and when she finished I said quietly that I needed actual facts rather than biblical guilt, starting with what the doctors wanted, what the insurance would cover, and why exactly I, the family embarrassment and disposable daughter, had magically become the designated wallet. The answer came in fragments that tasted like karmic tea, bitter but strangely warming. The house that looked like a triumph in photos had eaten more than their paychecks. The landscaping and the new kitchen and the perfect vacations had been financed by payments that enjoyed arriving monthly. The second car was fashionable but greedy. Mark's contract had not been renewed in the spring, which they had kept quiet to protect their image. Daniel's design business had been bleeding clients, which they had painted as a strategic pivot for social media, and while I listened, I finally understood that their stone castle had been a cardboard set, and that the rain had simply punched through faster than they expected. The surgeon explained that Daniel needed a complicated procedure that the hospital would not schedule without a financial pathway that did not end with my mother's trembling promises, and even though I am not made of ice, I am also not made of erasers. So I asked for a copy of whatever forms they wanted me to co-sign and read every line while the family tried to stare me into generosity, and as the zeros stacked themselves like dominoes, I felt that old hum of humiliation rise and then fall away, replaced by a cool clarity that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with refusing to be used again as the quiet scaffolding that holds up someone else's glossy life. I told them I would make some calls, and I did, but not the calls they imagined. I phoned my bank to verify the terms of the small family trust our father had created long before he died. The one my mother loved to pretend did not exist, because it annoyed her that it required the consent of both siblings for large disbursements. And when the officer confirmed the dual signature rule, I signed a formal objection to any emergency withdrawal that would be framed as temporary and become permanent. The minute the dust settled, because I had learned that what our family calls a bridge loan is usually a plank you are expected to stand on until the river decides you are furniture. Then I called the hospital billing office and asked whether the legal spouse's assets and income were considered primary for payment plans and charity applications, and when they said yes, I provided the information I knew: 2 cars, a remodeled kitchen, a home equity line drawn heavily in the last year, a lifestyle documented generously online, and requested they evaluate eligibility accordingly, not to sabotage his care, but to stop the performance where I would be cast as the single audience member funding a show that had already charged me admission twice. For flair, and perhaps for my own petty heart, I uploaded a quiet donation to the hospital's emergency relief fund in Daniel's name with a note that it could be used for any patient without family advocates. Because I wanted the universe to see that I was not cheering for suffering, I was simply refusing to pay for the same lesson again. And when my mother learned that the trust money was frozen without my consent, she called me a monster with a voice that cracked on the last syllable, but I let the word pass through me like wine through a screen, because sometimes the only way to survive a storm is to remove the furniture that keeps blowing into your face and call that housekeeping. As I turned to leave, Mark stepped into my path and whispered that there were things I did not know, that the accident was only the headline of a longer story. That Daniel had been terrified of something for weeks and had not told anyone because pride is a stubborn tutor, and he asked me to come back to the room and stand there for 1 minute when Daniel woke up so that he could say the sentence he should have said years ago. And I realized that my carefully wrapped retaliation had not closed the book but had only folded the corner of a page I had not read yet, because the surgeon walked past us at that exact moment and said that Daniel's pupils were reacting and that he might be conscious by evening, which meant my phone would soon carry a message that could make my spine soften or harden forever. And as the elevator doors slid open, I decided I would give them that 1 minute, not because they deserved it, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain that the next thing I did would be something I would never have to apologize for in the middle of the night. By the time the evening settled into that low hospital hum that makes every voice sound like a confession, I had circled the corridors enough times to memorize which ceiling tiles pretended to be clouds and which ones simply gave up. And when the nurse finally waved me in with the kind of softness that says she knows families are rarely tidy, I felt my shoulders lock in spite of every speech I had rehearsed in the elevator, because there he was, my brother who had looked invincible in every photo our mother framed, lying in a bed that made him look small and breakable and a little boy again, with tubes that punctuated his breathing and a livid scrape across his cheek like a map of the wrong turn everyone kept mentioning. And when his eyes found mine, they did not carry triumph or guilt or even shame. They carried a tired gratitude that made me angry and tender at the same time, which is a very specific kind of torture that sisters know too well and never admit to. He started with my name, stretching it like an apology had to walk a long distance to reach me. And before he could pivot into the well-worn phrases families use when they are trying to sand down history, I told him that 1 minute meant 1 minute, and that he should skip past the poetry and lay out the ledger. Because nurses can be bought with cookies but not with delay, and I wanted the facts lined up like bottles on a bar where no one could pretend the tab belonged to someone else, so he did. And what poured out was not romantic and not noble and not even particularly dramatic, just a stack of small bad choices that had grown tall and heavy, a client he had retained with promises that required upfront costs, a loan that came with a smile and teeth hid behind the paperwork, a late insurance payment that had seemed harmless until it was not, and a creeping panic that had been fed daily by pride and the mirage of keeping up the kind of life that photographs beautifully while hiding every draft bill in the junk drawer. And though he did not ask me to forgive Mark the way he once asked me to forgive him for breaking my favorite mug, he did say that Mark had been the one begging him to cut back, which I did not believe until I remembered the collapsed coffee cup and the way his hands shook around it like they were already used to losing. I told him quietly that fear did not entitle him to my savings and that love, whatever shape it took, did not erase a ledger where my name had been used as a punchline more than once, and he nodded with something that looked suspiciously like relief, which confused me until he admitted that part of him had always expected I would clean up the mess, because I always had, and that the minute I stepped away at the nurse's station earlier, he felt the air turn honest for the first time in a long time. And though I did not reward the speech with a hug, I did not punish it with silence. I simply said that if he wanted me to do anything, it would be the thing I am best at, which is telling the truth in rooms where lies have been living rent-free for years. The truth, as it often is, was annoyingly practical, so I asked for Mark, and when he came in with that haunted posture that men wear when the bravado has left through a side door, I told him we were going to speak like adults who had done very childish things, and that before the night ended there would be a plan that did not rhyme with fairy tale. I asked him point-blank about the insurance lapse, the second car, the line of credit dressed as a pet project, the contract that had failed to renew, and he answered each with the kind of clipped honesty that arrives once denial exhausts itself, and by the time he finished, even my mother had stopped rearranging her purse to look busy. Because there are moments when the performance cannot continue and everyone must stare at the naked stage. I do not know whether it was kindness or exhaustion that pushed me across the next threshold, but I walked down to the financial counselor's office with the steadiness of a woman who has been elected chair of a committee she never joined. And I said I wanted to put together a payment plan that matched the resources of the legal spouse and the homeowner while preserving my independence. And when the counselor asked whether the family would be comfortable submitting full documentation of assets and recent expenditures, I smiled in that friendly way that says the answer will be yes, even if it has to be dragged across the floor. Then I returned to the room and let everyone know that the hospital would be delighted to review their last 12 months of shiny purchases and philanthropic captions, after which funding options would become much clearer. And I swear I could hear the sound of a marble backsplash weeping somewhere in suburban silence. Because I am not merely a woman with boundaries, but a woman who enjoys tidy folders, I added one more step that did not require yelling or venom, only a keyboard and a polite tone. I drafted a notarized letter to the trustee confirming my refusal to authorize withdrawals and appended a schedule of Daniel and Mark's available equity calculated conservatively. Then I forwarded a calm, almost cheerful email to their mortgage servicer requesting hardship alternatives and payment deferrals triggered by medical events, which would temporarily protect the house while also flagging the account for spending audits that frown upon luxury purchases during forbearance. And when my mother accused me of orchestrating humiliation, I said that accountability is not humiliation. It is a mirror, and the only people who hate mirrors are the ones who know the light is coming. For dessert, and I admit this tasted sweet, I opened Daniel's phone with the code he had muttered between pain meds, our childhood street number, which hit me like a drive-by memory. And I scrolled past messages that were mostly noise until I found a thread from a client whose invoices had been padded by an intern who did not exist, which was the sort of amateur fraud that ruins futures in slow motion. And I packaged the thread with dates and amounts and sent it to Daniel's email with a subject line that promised a clean confession meeting once he was stable. Then I CC'd Mark so he could not pretend ignorance later. And as I pressed send, I felt that familiar click inside my chest. That means I have chosen my own side this time without apology. The machines kept their steady chorus. The nurse adjusted a line and winked at me like she recognized a woman taking back her oxygen. And as I stood to leave, Daniel grabbed my wrist with a surprising strength and whispered that the car did not simply skid, that someone had been following him for days and had flashed their brights in the mirror just before the curve, which sounded like a story fear tells at midnight until I remembered a black SUV that had idled too long outside my building last week, and the way my skin prickled even though nothing happened. So I leaned close and told him that if this was another lie, I would never forgive him, but if it was not, then the next signature I refused might be the one that kept all of us alive long enough to tell the truth in front of the right stranger. And I walked into the corridor already dialing a number I had kept for years. The private investigator who once saved a friend from a very expensive mistake, because revenge, when it grows up, learns to wear a suit and carry a clipboard, and mine had just put on both while something dark and patient watched from the other end of the parking lot. The private investigator answered on the first ring with the same measured calm he had used years ago when he untangled a friend's disastrous engagement, and after I sketched the rough outline, an accident that might not have been an accident. A black SUV that enjoyed lurking, a brother tangled in debts and pride, and an ex whose bravado had quietly retired. I authorized him to do what he does best, which is to make truth take a number and step into the light. Then I walked back to the ward with the stubborn grace of someone who knows she is about to be called cold by people who never notice the heating bill. Because the doctor needed signatures for routine consents that did not involve my finances, and I was not going to hand them an excuse to paint me as cruel when all I was being was careful. While we waited for the next round of scans, my mother started that familiar chorus about family duty and how time heals if you stop picking at the wound. So I asked her whether time had healed my marriage when she posted photographs of Daniel and Mark carving a turkey at the very table I had saved for months to buy, and whether time had paid any of my moving costs when she decided the best way to keep peace was to ask me to stay away so the boys could build something beautiful without the awkwardness of my grief, and when she tried to point toward heaven, I pointed toward the hospital billing office and said that charity begins with honesty and documentation, not with pressing the one daughter you discarded into funding your favorite son's sequel. And the look she gave me could have curdled milk, which under other circumstances might have been useful in coffee. Mark returned from a meeting with the financial counselor looking like a man who had finally met the cashier at the end of the buffet, because the counselor had explained in slow, careful phrases that payment plans would be based on verified income and assets, and that any assistance program would require full transparency, which meant the remodeled kitchen, the second car, and the curated vacations would now pose for a very different camera. And although he tried to salvage pride by mumbling that everyone juggles, sometimes I told him that juggling is a hobby and embezzling from your future to look good at the barbecue is a lifestyle. Then I slid across the table a simple spreadsheet I had made on my phone with realistic cuts and a timeline that would keep the procedure scheduled and the roof overhead while trimming every vanity back to humility. And to his credit, he did not argue, because humility, once it lands, has a way of clearing the room. The investigator sent the first update before midnight, a neat message with the SUV's plate number and a thumbnail photograph that looked like a night creature caught in a flash, along with a note that the registration led to a small logistics company whose owner had done contract work for one of Daniel's clients, which by itself could have been noise if not for the second detail tucked politely at the end. The insurance policy on that SUV had been paid in the last quarter by a cashier's check, purchased by someone using my mother's maiden name, a coincidence so acrobatic it deserved an audience, and when I looked up from the screen I found my mother arranging the flowers she had brought, plucking at the petals as though beauty could be coaxed from discipline alone, and I heard myself ask whether she had been helping Daniel stay afloat in ways that would not survive sunlight. She tried the most fragile defense first, the one where parents insist they only wanted to protect their child from shame, and when I did not flinch she pivoted into offense, accusing me of cruelty and dramatic thinking and a vindictive imagination that turned headlights into villains. So I told her that imagination had nothing to do with bank slips and that the only drama I was interested in was the kind that ended with signed agreements and canceled cards, after which I picked up the phone, called the hospital security desk, and requested that the parking lot cameras from the afternoon be archived and held. Then I forwarded the investigator's note to the counselor, because nothing accelerates accountability like paperwork traveling at the speed of truth, and for a fleeting moment I almost felt sorry for the life we had all pretended to inhabit, since nothing dies more pitifully than a costume that believes it is skin. Revenge, which I have learned can be both elegant and administrative, arrived in two precise moves that did not require shouting or theatrics, only signatures and timing. First, I filed a petition for temporary medical conservatorship limited to financial decision-making for Daniel's care, citing the conflict of interest between a spouse whose spending had contributed to the crisis and a parent who had facilitated questionable payments, and while a judge might or might not grant it, I knew the filing itself would freeze any midnight adventures with accounts labeled family. Second, I opened a secure escrow dedicated to the hospital's invoices where every dollar would come from verified sources, which meant there would be no last-minute raids on the old trust or quiet transfers from my accounts dressed up as kindness, and, because I believe in tidy symmetry, I named the escrow with a phrase that made me smile, clean hands, so that every time someone checked the balance they would be reminded of the condition for entry. When Mark asked whether I was trying to punish him, I said that punishment is noisy and brief while boundaries are quiet and permanent, and that if he wanted mercy, he could start by printing the last 12 months of statements and bringing them to the counselor with a pen and a spine, and he surprised me by nodding, which almost softened me until he added that Daniel had been terrified not of losing the house, but of someone who had begun sending messages that sounded like favors with invoices attached, and that he had refused to tell me because he assumed I would turn the whole thing into a lecture, which was rude but not inaccurate, so I told him the lecture could wait and the documentation could not. Then I stepped into the hallway to answer the investigator's second call, where he said he had traced a payment from the logistics company to a shell that sat under a church charity's umbrella run by a board where my mother volunteered. A structure that could be innocent but smelled like the kind of laundering people attempt when they panic, and as the elevator doors opened to swallow me for another round of signatures, I felt the smallest, sharpest click in my chest, the one I get when the last piece of a puzzle slides into place. Because the person who had been staging the family opera might not have been Daniel or Mark at all, and if I was right, then the next conversation would not take place at a bedside, but in a quiet office with glass walls where the only sound is the pen that writes the end of a performance. Morning seeped through the blinds of the hospital lounge with that washed-out light that makes everything look temporary. And as I stirred the bitter coffee they called complimentary, I realized that the night had not actually delivered rest, but had instead stacked questions like poker chips on the table in my head, each one daring me to gamble what little peace I had left. The investigator's report sat heavy in my inbox. The judge's clerk had already confirmed receipt of the conservatorship petition, and Daniel's chart carried a neat line of optimism that suggested the surgery might be successful if the paperwork aligned. Yet beneath all that procedural order hummed the chaos of something older, deeper, and far more dangerous. The revelation that the family I had once trusted with my softest years might have been scripting my downfall with more intention than I had ever wanted to admit. When I stepped into Daniel's room that morning, the change was visible. His face, though pale, carried color in the cheeks, and his eyes tracked me with a steadiness that suggested the fog had begun to lift. He asked if I had slept, and though I could have lied, I said no, because exhaustion was less a condition and more a costume I had been forced to wear for years. Then, without ceremony, he confessed that the SUV had not been a hallucination born of panic. He claimed he had been warned weeks earlier that if he didn't make certain repayments, through family channels, the roads he drove might become less forgiving. He admitted he had ignored the threats, assuming they were hollow, until the headlights arrived like ghosts from the rearview mirror. And then he turned his head slowly, painfully, toward our mother who stood in the corner arranging her face into neutrality, and I watched silence spread like oil across the room as if truth itself had finally taken its seat. I pressed him for details, and he gave them with the weary precision of a man who knew he had run out of disguises, a client with ties to less-than-legal networks, money funneled through charitable accounts where our mother volunteered, payments disguised as donations. And then the growing awareness that he had walked into a structure where favors were bought with loyalty and fear more than invoices. My mother tried to intervene, her voice slicing through the air with phrases about exaggeration and stress and medication confusion, but the investigator had already sent me copies of receipts that carried her maiden name. And when I slid my phone across the tray so that she could see them, her lips tightened into that line I had grown up fearing, the one that meant she would never admit defeat even when the evidence clanged like church bells. Mark, perhaps finally tired of living inside a performance he could no longer sustain, broke the standstill by admitting he had begged Daniel to walk away months ago, that he had known some of the risks but had been silenced by the combined weight of Daniel's pride and my mother's constant reassurance that these things get smoothed out if you keep the right people happy. He said he had stayed partly out of guilt and partly out of cowardice, and though I had every right to spit fury in his face, I found myself strangely calm, as though anger had burned itself into ash long ago and all that remained was the cool clarity of choice. So I made my choice. I told the room that my finances would not be open like a vein to feed debts I did not create, and that while I would not obstruct the surgery, I would not rescue their house, their cars, their curated image, or the social life they had purchased with borrowed gold. The escrow would pay the hospital directly once insurance and assets were tallied, nothing more, nothing less. And then I delivered the line that had lived inside me since the first day betrayal broke my marriage. He stole my husband. He built his happiness on my pain, and now you think I'll pay to keep him alive? Not a chance. The words did not crack like lightning, they settled like stone, undeniable and immovable, and for once the room did not argue, because the truth had filled every corner. I walked out before anyone could assemble another plea. In the hallway, the investigator waited with a folder tucked under his arm, eyes sharp with the satisfaction of a man who knows his work has teeth. He murmured that the next steps might involve law enforcement if I wanted, that the financial structures could collapse into indictments, that my mother's carefully cultivated reputation could vanish in hearings. I thanked him, but told him not yet, because sometimes the most exquisite revenge is not fireworks, but the slow, public unraveling of the lies people stitched so carefully. At home that evening, I poured myself a glass of wine, the silence wrapping me in something almost gentle. My phone buzzed with messages, my mother demanding reconsideration, Mark begging for help, Daniel's name flashing with half-formed apologies, but I let them pile up unanswered. I sat by the window watching the city light itself like a stage, and I realized that revenge had not been the act of refusing money or filing petitions or even exposing their secrets. Revenge had been learning to stand in my own life without flinching, to say no without apology, to walk away without checking whether they followed. And yet, in the quiet between sips, I wondered if the headlights that had trailed Daniel might one day find me, if the networks he had entangled himself with would decide that blood is still blood, no matter how bruised. That question lingered, sharp and unresolved, and I knew it would never fully vanish. But as I set the glass down and let the night carry me forward, I understood something simple. Uncertainty is survivable, betrayal is survivable, even fear is survivable, but silence, the silence of never choosing yourself, is not. So I chose. And that, more than anything, was the ending they would never rewrite.